Hook, curiosity capture. Everyone in town whispered about the old school on the hill, but no one spoke about room 17. It was locked for years, abandoned in silence, until one night, when a substitute teacher unknowingly unlocked the door. What she found inside changed the fate of the school forever. Ananya had always believed that teaching was more than just a profession. It was a responsibility, a calling. When she got a last-minute offer to substitute at St. Mary's Convent, she didn't hesitate, despite the eerie stories surrounding the place. The school, built in the late 1800s, had an unsettling history of disappearances, but Ananya dismissed them as myths. She needed this job, her sick mother depended on her, and debts were piling up. As she walked through the dimly lit corridors, she felt a chill, but she ignored it. After all, ghosts weren't real, or so she thought. The class list had no mention of room 17, yet the principal, an elderly nun, insisted she take attendance there. Confused, Ananya searched for the door and found it at the very end of the corridor, rusted with deep claw marks on the wood. Inside, desks were arranged neatly, and students in old-fashioned uniforms sat silently, staring at her with hollow eyes. The air smelled damp, decayed, but when she blinked, the children disappeared. The room was completely empty. A cold whisper brushed against her ear. "You shouldn't be here, Miss Ananya." The door slammed shut behind her. Panic surged through her as she struggled to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The chalkboard began writing on its own. The name Mr. Das scrawled repeatedly in jagged handwriting. Ananya remembered the name, a beloved teacher who had vanished mysteriously years ago. As she turned, she saw something that shattered her heart. A young boy, no older than 10, stood in the corner, sobbing. His uniform was stained with blood. "Help me, miss," he whimpered. "He's still here, and he's coming." Before she could react, shadowy arms yanked the child into the floor, his screams echoing through the room. The ground beneath Ananya split open, revealing a hidden basement. Struggling to keep her balance, she peered down and saw dozens of skeletal remains, some still clutching pencils and notebooks. The missing students, they had never left. Their bones were arranged in a circle, and in the center stood a figure dressed in an old teacher's coat. His face half decayed, his eyes burning red. Mr. Das was still here, and then he spoke, his voice layered with agony and rage. "Class is in session, forever." A force pulled Ananya toward the pit as ghostly hands reached out for her. She screamed, but just as she was about to fall, the principal appeared at the door, whispering an ancient prayer. The grip loosened, and the shadows recoiled. The door creaked open, and Ananya stumbled out, gasping for breath. But before she could question what had happened, the principal whispered something that froze her blood. "Mr. Das was my brother, and I locked him in that room 40 years ago." To be continued. The door of room 17 had shut behind her, but something was still with her. Ananya could feel it, a presence watching, whispering, waiting. The school might have locked away its darkest secret, but secrets have a way of escaping. That night, as she lay in bed, she heard it again. "Class is in session, forever." And this time, the voice was right beside her. Ananya sat motionless in the dimly lit room of her small apartment, gripping a cup of tea that had gone cold long ago. Her mother's frail voice crackled from the other room, asking if she was all right. But how could she answer? How could she tell her mother that she had seen ghostly children disappear before her eyes, that she had nearly been dragged into a grave of forgotten souls? That a teacher, long thought to be missing, was still teaching from the beyond? Tears welled in her eyes. She had taken this job to save herself and her mother from their financial struggles. But had she instead doomed herself to something far worse? A sudden knock on her window shattered the silence. Ananya's breath caught in her throat. She lived on the 3rd floor. The knock came again, slow and deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. Trembling, she turned her head toward the window. A pale, lifeless face pressed against the glass. It was the little boy from room 17. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Then, his eyes rolled back, and he began to bang his forehead against the glass, harder and harder, until cracks webbed across the surface. Blood seeped from his head, but he didn't stop. Then, in a voice too deep for a child, he spoke. "He knows you saw. Now you belong to him." The glass shattered. Ananya screamed as shards of glass flew toward her, shielding herself with her arms. But when she opened her eyes, the window was intact. No cracks, no blood, nothing. Had she imagined it? Her mother called out again, asking what was wrong. She sounded weaker than before. Ananya rushed to her mother's room and gasped. The old woman lay still, eyes wide open, her lips moving in an unseen conversation. Her frail hands clutched at the blanket as though someone invisible was holding her down. Mother's gaze remained empty. Then, in a voice that was not her own, her mother whispered, "The lesson has begun." And then her body went limp. A chilling gust of wind swept through the room, and a piece of paper fluttered onto Ananya's lap. It was old, yellowed, and covered in childish handwriting. Her stomach twisted as she read the words aloud. "Today, Mr. Das taught us how to never leave his class." Ananya's hands trembled. It was a page from an old class notebook. But how did it get here? As she flipped it over, her heart nearly stopped. Her own name was written at the bottom. The room darkened, and a voice whispered from the shadows. "You were always meant to be my best student, Ananya." She turned slowly, and there, standing in the doorway, was Mr. Das. Ananya tried to scream, but her voice wouldn't come. Mr. Das stepped closer, his eyes gleaming like burning embers, his decayed lips curling into a sick smile. "You're failing the lesson, Ananya," he hissed. "But don't worry. Detention lasts forever."